Afraid of the Power of Israel in the United States by James Petras. Mad Dog Ravages Lebanon. Kristallnacht, the 1939 Nazi assault on Jewish homes, stores, and persons in reprisal for a Jew killing a German embassy officer, was a garden party compared to the Jewish state's ongoing destruction of Lebanon. The Nazi reprisal led to the killing of several Jews and property damage in the millions of dollars. Israel's murder and destruction toll as of August 1, 2006, already included over 828 Lebanese civilians dead, 3,200 wounded, 750,000, some say 900,000 refugees, hundreds of destroyed apartment buildings, thousands of homes, schools, factories, aqueducts, water and sewage treatment facilities, churches and mosques, radio and television stations, all the major bridges and highways, the airports and ports. In fact, anything and anybody standing, hiding, or fleeing for safety. Israel's deliberate total blockade, in addition to its carpet bombing, has created a humanitarian catastrophe for 2.5 million Lebanese, including the 750,000 refugees. According to the Financial Times, the humanitarian situation has been made worse by an Israeli sea and air blockade and the targeting of roads and bridges that hinder the distribution of aid, both to the refugees and to the people who have stayed behind. Refugees tell of days of Israeli shelling, shortages of water and food, power outages, and cut phone lines. Even more sinister, many refugees recount how they were first told by Israel to leave, only to be hit by Israeli shelling on the road to safety. Even humanitarian aid and assistance was targeted. As the British Guardian reported on July 25, 2006, the ambulance headlights were on. The blue light overhead was flashing and another light illuminated the Red Cross flag when the first Israeli missile hit, shearing off the right leg of the man on the stretcher. As he lay screaming beneath fire and smoke, patients and ambulance workers scrambled for safety, crawling over grass in the dark. Then another missile hit the second ambulance. No matter, all the major Jewish organizations in the US, Europe, and Canada pledged fealty to the Israeli state and endorse its crimes against humanity, as do all the mass media. They influence or control the US Congress, executive branch, and trade union confederations in the US. The big lie of Israeli reprisals has been repeated so often in the media and in official circles that it is taken as an accepted fact. If we return to the ancient history of July 12, 2006, we discover that Hezbollah attacked an Israeli army post on the border with Lebanon, a military target with no civilian significance. Immediately after this localized military incident, Prime Minister Olmert ordered massive bombing of Beirut and civilian targets throughout Lebanon. After Israel carpet bombing of civilians and civilian infrastructure throughout Lebanon, Hezbollah responded on July 14, 2006 by declaring war on Israel, namely bombing Israeli cities. On July 14, 2006, the Jewish lobby propaganda and power machine went into action, criticizing Bush over his concern for the Lebanese client regime, which the White House had so laboriously put in place. Abraham Foxman, national director of the Anti-Defamation League, sharply attacked Bush for asking Tel Aviv to show restraint and not undermine Lebanese Prime Minister SEYMOUR. The Conference of the Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations put its 52 groups into action. Bush quickly backtracked and forgot about his Lebanese client. Israel and the 52 groups pushed the U.S. to supply more 5-ton bombs for its bombers to drop on a defenseless country without a functioning air force. The leading ideologues of the Jewish lobby pushed for the U.S. to bomb Iran and Syria, the, quote, hand behind Hezbollah, hoping to start Israeli Ambassador Gillerman's World War III. The unanimity of the major Jewish organizations' support for Israeli ethnocide extends to the peacetime Israeli peace organizations and progressives like Amos Oz, who calls on Israel's peace organizations to close ranks behind the butchers of Beirut in the name of the defense of Israel. As Washington rushes a new supply of 5-ton bombs and precision missiles there can be no doubt that the Israeli leaders' destruction of the civilian homes, apartments, and infrastructure is a precisely calculated target. As precision-guided missiles are playing a key part in Israel's military strategy, it is clear that the repeated bombing of hospitals, mosques, refugee caravans, and ambulances on the highways and the Muslim and Christian sectors of Beirut and other cities are an integral part of that strategy. Professor Juan Cole argues persuasively that the war on Lebanon was planned for at least a year, citing the presentations by senior Israeli army officers to Washington think tanks, diplomats, and journalists outlining the coming invasion. The Israeli pretext of rescuing 2 captured soldiers is laughable, given the instant massive offensive and the sustained destruction of all of Lebanon, including large areas of central and northern Lebanon where there are few, if any, Hezbollah. It ill behooves us to ignore the recent historical context for the Israeli bombing and wanton murder of Lebanese. For several years, the Jewish lobby has pressured the White House and Congress to disarm and destroy Hezbollah. To accomplish that goal, it was necessary to change the correlation of forces in Lebanon by forcing the Syrians out, which was successfully accomplished through the assassination of a prominent Lebanese politician, Hariri, then pinning the murder on the Syrian intelligence. Though it was demonstrably counter to Syrian interests, no proof was ever presented, and perjured testimony later retracted was the sole evidence. Subsequent to Syria's departure, a Lebanese assassin in the pay of the Israeli Secret Service, Mossad, was captured by the anti-Syrian Lebanese police and admitted to committing numerous bombing assassinations on Lebanese citizens targeted by the Israelis. With Syria out of Lebanon, Washington secured a one-sided UN resolution calling for the disarming of Hezbollah without any military or territorial concessions from Israel, such as the return of Israeli-occupied Lebanese Sheba farms, or the return of Lebanese or Hezbollah prisoners who had been languishing in Israeli prisons for up to 10 years. That UN resolution, probably the only one Israel abides by for obvious reasons, subsequently provided part of the cover for Israel's invasion as it bombed Lebanon into a miserable state more like Afghanistan than the vibrant Mediterranean republic it had been just days before. Israel's strategy was transparent. It sought to isolate Hezbollah in the world, securing UN support via Washington, secured in turn by pressure from the lobby on the Bush administration, with a view to promoting an internal conflict in Lebanon between Hezbollah and the Lebanese government, in which the US/UN would then intervene in favor of its favored Beirut clients, likely the Christian Maronites, who presumably were to have been goaded into action against Hezbollah by the Israeli assault against its own sector. Failing on both counts, Israel decided in consultation with Washington to launch a frontal murderous assault on Lebanon on the pretext of the captured soldiers and Israel's need to eliminate the, quote, terrorist organization Hezbollah. The Israeli military attack presented several favorable future possibilities apart from the destruction of the anti-imperialist Hezbollah. One was the opportunity to isolate and create a pretext to attack Syria and Iran if they exerted any efforts on behalf of the Lebanese. Secondly, Washington saw the Israeli invasion as a means to distract horrified world opinion away from the U.S. genocidal occupation of Iraq. Thirdly, the Bush administration sought to secure the Jewish lobby's continued powerful media influence in support of the U.S. occupation of Iraq when a majority of U.S. citizens were increasingly hostile. Finally, in acceding to supply Israel with weapons of mass destruction like 5-ton bombs, the Republicans and Democrats sought to secure campaign funding from their millionaire and billionaire Jewish political supporters. Not to be left behind in the race for the hearts and minds of Israel supporters, Democratic National Chairman Howard Dean, once the beneficiary of an internet campaign by progressives supporting his drive for the presidency based on his condemnation of the war in Iraq, attracted wide media attention for his fulmination that the Iraqi prime minister was an, quote, anti-Semite for refusing to denounce Hezbollah. For Israel, the military attack was directed toward destroying all of Lebanon. converting it into an economic wasteland while ethnically cleansing the Lebanese civilians from southern Lebanon, facilitating its declaring the country a free fire zone to be bombed at will, killing any remaining persons on the grounds that they were Hezbollah sympathizers, activists, social workers, medics, and fighters. The strategy was to empty the pond, southern Lebanon and South Beirut, perhaps 40% of the country's population, to catch the fish, Hezbollah. Hezbollah is a mass political and social movement with a base of 1.1 million Lebanese, which, inter alia, provided social services to local populations in what might have been viewed as in the best traditions of progressive socio-political movements, had not racist bias and antipathy toward religion, or only specifically toward Islam, since if similar activity had been undertaken by Christian activists in Latin America would have been embraced by Western progressives. In the process, Israel sought to create a client regime in Lebanon and to cut off the moral and material support that Hezbollah gives to the democratically elected Hamas government in Palestine. In the course of events, Israeli and U.S. assumptions failed. Israel's massive terror bombing undermined the pro-U.S. Beirut regime and turned the great majority of Lebanese in favor of Hezbollah, as surely might have been anticipated since recent infliction of collective punishment on the population of Iraq, with a view to turning them against even such a tyrant as Saddam Hussein, had miserably failed. In the total absence of the Lebanese government, it was Hezbollah that rushed victims to hospitals, provided food, evacuation convoys, and a modicum of relief to all Lebanese, regardless of affiliation. Washington's precautions to the Israelis to respect Lebanese civilians and civilian infrastructure were brazenly ignored by the Jewish state from the start, which knew full well that the Jewish lobby in the U.S. would ensure Washington's complicity in mass murder and the undermining of its own client regime. There was never any question when facing a choice between defending a conservative, recently installed Lebanese regime or supporting Israel's total war that the White House would support the lobby in Tel Aviv, hands down. If the U.S. miscalculated on Israel's precision intervention, the Jewish state overestimated its capacity to bomb Hezbollah into submission. The Israeli regime then proceeded to launch a land war, which is extremely costly in the mountainous zones of South Lebanon. For the first time, there were large-scale and mounting Israeli military casualties, not only innocent, unarmed Lebanese families targeted by Israeli planes and helicopters were dying. In attacking and capturing 2 Israeli soldiers, Hezbollah had sought to come to the humanitarian aid of the besieged Palestinians of Gaza, who were suffering the hammer blows of Israel's invasion and daily assassinations. Neither Syria nor Iran had any influence on Hezbollah's decision to take Israeli pressure off the Palestinians. According to several Iran experts, Iran has taken a pragmatic approach in its foreign policy and does not want to get into a serious confrontation with Israel. Another expert argued, quote, Iran was not looking for a crisis in Lebanon at a critical moment in the nuclear diplomacy. An expert on Hezbollah pointed out, quote, it was inconceivable that Iran had ordered Hezbollah to take Israeli soldiers prisoner. Hezbollah leaders are not the types to take orders from elsewhere. This, of course, doesn't exclude the corollary motivations that Hezbollah sought to secure a prisoner exchange for some Lebanese political prisoners who had been held by Israel, some for over a decade, as well as to free Lebanese territory still under Israeli occupation. By attacking Lebanon and focusing on Hezbollah, Israel sought to further isolate the Palestinian government and to continue its policy of bombing the Palestinian people into, quote, voluntary exodus. During the first 2 weeks of the Lebanese bombing, Israel continued its assassination and bombing campaign in Gaza and the West Bank, killing and maiming scores of civilians, children, and resistance fighters. Perversely, by raising the death toll to nearly 500, destruction, an estimated $2 billion, and forced exodus of at least 750,000 civilians in Lebanon as of July 27, 2006, Israel has effectively distracted the philo-Israeli mass media from the daily murder and injury of dozens of Palestinians. Mass media coverage of Israeli genocide in Lebanon is, at its worst, the television media, CBS, NBC, ABC, CNN, and National Public Radio, and the respectable press not only repeat the Israeli propaganda about, quote, precision-guided missiles destroying Hezbollah bunkers, but focus on the handful of Israeli deaths and injuries, sometimes resorting to news items of days earlier in order to try to project an image of Israeli suffering to correspond to that of the current daily images of Lebanese civilian deaths and injuries in the thousands, and of the million who are homeless, without electricity or water, even while still subject to 5-ton bombs dropped by merciless, unopposed Israeli pilots purportedly looking for, quote, bunkers, but locating multi-storied apartment blocks instead. At least 1/3 of Lebanese casualties are children, according to the UN Jan Egelan, after a field inspection. Less than 1/10 of Hezbollah fighters, less than 1/10 are Hezbollah fighters. Faced with massive civilian bombings, U.S. Secretary of State Rice referred to the devastation as the birth pangs of a new order, just as her predecessors in the Third Reich justified the bombing of London during World War II. On July 24, 2006, the Daily Alert, the news sheet of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations, published and republished articles written by apologists for Israel's bloody invasion. Not a single criticism of the flight of at least 750,000 refugees, not a word of the destruction of apartments, not even a passing mention of the murder of over 100 children. Quotes from President Bush opposing a ceasefire from ultra-rightist Israel firster Ambassador Bolton, U.S. ambassador to the UN, defending Israel's terror bombing, arguing that the relatively few rockets falling in Israel were of greater concern than the destruction of the entire infrastructure of Lebanon, the pollution of its entire coastline, and the killing and maiming of thousands of civilians, 1/3 of whom were children. Op-ed articles in the Washington Post, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, and New Republic supported Israel's bloodbath. Editorials in the Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, and Miami Herald closely followed the Israeli lobby's lines. The entire massive Jewish and pro-Israel propaganda machine has covered the U.S. media with messages of unconditional support for Israeli murder, denials of Lebanese suffering, and justification of the wanton destruction presented as an act of heroic defense by the mad dogs, reference Moshe Dayan, of Israel. The voices of Americans horrified by Israeli atrocities, or who just feel sympathy for its victims, go unheeded, or worse, are attacked and ridiculed. The veteran octogenarian White House correspondent Helen Thomas, of Lebanese ethnic origin, was taunted as the, quote, voice of Hezbollah by the president's press secretary, Tony Snow. The U.S. peace movement, prohibited by its Jewish progressives from voicing outrage at Israel, let alone the lobby, is moribund. Once again, Israel gets away with murder. Its overseas political transmission belts dominate the mass media. The U.S. Congress kneels to the lobby's dictates. The entire White House staff act as messengers for the Israeli Foreign Office, while Israel in turn broadcasts that it has U.S. permission for its behavior, sweeping aside all niceties, with no concern whatsoever for the evident public embarrassment that this might cause its benefactor. The U.S. submission and complicity in the Gaza ethnocide and now the destruction of Lebanon without internal debate in Congress, in the mass media, or even in the so-called peace movements speaks loudly and clearly to the stranglehold of Israeli power within the United States and to the enormous and continuing damage to our basic democratic freedoms. To stand against totalitarian terror and U.S. complicity should be a common reflexive act of decency. Today, under the lobby's all-pervasive domain, it is an act of courage, even though it may reach only a few tens of thousands through the alternative media. Israel's idea of a, quote, ceasefire, parroted by the Israel lobby and regurgitated by the U.S. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice to Lebanese leaders, is to first allow Israel to continue the carpet bombing of Lebanon with the newly shipped 5-ton American bombs, thus rejecting the Lebanese Prime Minister's pleas for an immediate ceasefire. Once Israel has totally devastated the country, Washington will propose a, quote, international force of Israel's choosing, along with the Lebanese army, to occupy southern Lebanon, currently under Israeli occupation, with the remnant of the battered, unarmed UN peacekeepers. The international force is then supposed to proceed to the total disarming and forced removal of all Hezbollah fighters and their 500,000 supporters in the south. At that point, Israel would consider a ceasefire. Apparently, Israel's mad dog disease is contagious and has affected the few remaining gray cells in the White House. According to the New York Times, there are no commitments for the proposed international force. The U.S. has ruled out its soldiers participating. NATO says it's overstretched. Britain feels its troops are overcommitted. And Germany says it is willing to participate only if Hezbollah agrees. Secondly, following on the Israeli scorched earth policy and Hezbollah's tough resistance, few, if any, Lebanese soldiers will take up arms to implement Israel's conditions, as even the conservative Lebanese leaders reject a foreign occupation. Thirdly, and most important, Hezbollah is prepared for and capable of engaging in a prolonged popular guerrilla war of resistance, such as Israel has never faced before in terms of organization, morale, and military capability. According to Jane's Defense Weekly, analyst Nicholas Blandford, the Hezbollah are well-armed, well-motivated combat veterans from the 1990s. It is the old Mao Zedong guerrilla strategy of retreating when the enemy advances and advancing when the enemy retreats. According to another expert on Hezbollah, they operate in small isolated cells. One cell does not know what the other cell is doing. This decentralized structure is part of the group's military potency. Hezbollah's military force, as large as 7,500 fighters, has, like the Vietnamese earlier, been preparing underground tunnels across South Lebanon and has built an advanced, well-stocked armory. Unlike previous Arab armies, which were heavily infiltrated and which fought standing wars under highly centralized commands, Hezbollah works in small, decentralized groups that move quickly and have taken effective measures against Israeli informers. Hezbollah is waiting for a full-scale ground invasion to fight a guerrilla war in the mountains and on their terrain. According to Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah, when the Israelis enter, they must pay dearly in terms of their tanks, officers, and soldiers. Israel is clearly not going to win a 7-day war. Even in the first 10 days, Alon Ben David, a Jane's Defense Weekly correspondent, wrote that the Israeli military has suffered considerable casualties in its push north to Lebanon. Epilogue. Thanks to the power of the U.S. Jewish lobby and the reach of its international affiliates, the U.S. government secured the agreement of the World's Powers meeting in Rome on July 26, 2006, to give Israel's mad dogs free rein to continue their genocidal policies in Lebanon and Gaza, a vote hailed by the mouthpiece of the Conference of Presidents of the major Jewish organizations. Given the lobby supremo's efforts to stifle dissent from genocide, special importance should be given to the fact that the Rome vote took place less than 24 hours after Israel deliberately murdered, decapitated 4 UN peacekeepers through direct targeting of their camp, even after having received over a dozen frantic phone calls from the beleaguered international peacekeepers before, during, and after the Israeli missile and tank shelling attack, advising that they were being shelled and pleading for cessation. Even UN Secretary General Kofi Annan couldn't stomach the Israelis' claims of error. His statement that the Israelis deliberately attacked the unarmed UN observers in their clearly marked outposts provoked fits of indignation in Israel and among Israel firsters in the U.S. Needless to say, the U.S. Jewish lobby automatically backed Israel's slaughter of the UN peacekeepers and published the demand of Dan Avallon, Israeli ambassador to the U.S., that Secretary General Annan apologize for his baseless charges. In the meantime, the respectable press, led by the ultra-Zionist Washington Post, continued to provide exclusive editorial and news space for the apologists of Israeli genocide in Lebanon. David Rivkin Jr. and Lee A. Casey argued that the mass terror bombing of Lebanon and, by the same logic, of Gaza are within Israel's right, and went on to provide convoluted, pseudo-legal arguments that would have made Goebbels blush. Needless to say, we are told that both authors served in the Reagan Justice Department, apparently cutting their teeth sanitizing the Central American killing fields. Israel and the compliant press immediately presented the Rome meeting as having given Israel permission to commit every outrageous crime forbidden in the UN Charter under the rubric of crimes against humanity. However, the succeeding coverage given to the denials that this had been the case, not only from the Finnish foreign minister whose country holds the EU presidency, but even from a senior spokesperson from the US State Department who called the assertion outrageous, has been muted in the extreme. As the world's attention turned to the genocide in Lebanon, the Israeli military machine continued to slaughter Palestinian children and civilians. Reuters reported that 19 Palestinians, over half civilians, including 3 children under 4, were killed and 60 people wounded. The toll of Palestinian dead and wounded in the Jewish state's month-long assault rose to over 1,000, a matter barely covered in the press, as if the long-time victimized Palestinians had somehow been implicated in their fate, whereas the Lebanese, still newly targeted, for the time being at least, enjoy the aura of innocence and hence merit greater coverage. The official Israeli peaceniks have joined the war party, as have most of their followers, though not the astute and steadfast Yuri Avnery. A poll published by Israel's Ma'ariv daily newspaper states that 82% back the continued offensive and 95% say Israel's action is justified. Since Israel is generally considered a democracy limited to its Jewish citizens, we can safely state that the overwhelming majority of Israeli Jews are knowing and willing accomplices to Israeli crimes against humanity. Did Goldhagen ever find a consensus of 95% of Germans in favor of Nazi ethnic cleansing? Likewise, in the United States and Europe, the great majority of Zionist organizations and their activists are extremely mobilized towards securing U.S. support for Israeli genocide. The hidden horror and the voices of dissent of many U.S. citizens are stifled by the overbearing dominance of the Jewish lobby's monopoly of the mass media. It is as if the lobby-promoted invasion of Iraq was a dry run for U.S. backing for Israeli invasions in the Middle East aimed at provoking major wars with Iran and Syria.